Chapter 14, Saints and Sinners. Well, that was intense. Twilight Sparkle stated aloud to her companion, pebbles crunching under hoof as they walked down the dirt path to the castle. At her side Darren Grandel let out a long sigh. After his enraged attempt to kill Discord, that failed do more to blind luck than anything else, and during which he displayed the shocking ability to completely nullify his opponent's magic, something Twilight fully intended to ask him about once Darren had calmed down a bit more. Darren had spent several minutes apologizing profusely to a slightly traumatized Fluttershy. In the end, however, Fluttershy was kind enough to grant her understanding for Darren's misreading of the situation, and accepted it all as water under the bridge. They had subsequently left her tending to Discord, who, until Darren had given him an excoriating glare, had been hamming it up by claiming to be plagued by emotional distress. "Forgive me, milady, but the Chaos Bringer and I have a rather complicated history," he explained, trying to sound calm, and not burden his friend with his actual feelings on finding Discord alive and well after all these centuries. Twilight glanced up at him out of the corner of her eye, and was relieved to see that his irises remained their original shade of blue. They had restored themselves shortly after Darren had finished having an exceedingly tense tete-a-tete with Discord. In fact, the shift had been so sudden Twilight almost could have passed the initial transformation off as a trick of the light. "What happened?" she asked curiously. Darren sighed again as he considered how to answer. "He humiliated Celestia and Luna, and I swore I would feed him his own heart for it. I caught him, and I beat him within an inch of his repugnant existence," he said hatefully, before pausing and letting out a deep breath to regain his composure. "But, the Seraphs forbid me to kill him. I was not happy about it, but I obeyed. However, I warned the wretch that if he ever returned to Equestria, I would tear him apart piece by piece, reassemble him, and then tear him apart all over again," Darren explained, the fury in his voice barely restrained. "That's quite a threat," Twilight remarked, feeling a little disturbed by the mental image it conjured up. "What exactly did he do to make you so angry?" she asked. Discord may have been a malevolent trickster once, but she found it hard to believe, even at his worst, that he could inspire such intense hate. Darren shook his head. "That is unimportant. Suffice to say it hurt Celestia and Luna deeply, and I doubt I will ever truly forgive him for it," Darren stated, restraining himself from saying more with a visible effort. "Let us speak of other things. You must be overjoyed to see your brother and his family? I seem to recall you mentioned you had a sibling, but you never informed me that he was married to a Seraph," Darren said with a smile, as he forced his thoughts regarding the Chaos Bringer to the back of his mind. Twilight nodded, all too happy to change the subject to something less volatile. "Well, it certainly wasn't expected, but yeah, I am happy to see him, though I think you might intimidate him a little," Twilight mentioned with a giggle. Darren responded with a laugh, allowing the humor to finish washing away his dark mood. "Such was not my intent, I assure you," he said with a wide grin. Twilight returned Darren's smile with a laugh of her own, a slight flutter in her heart. As the dark cloud of Darren's anger lifted, and he once more became the stallion she had come to adore. However, as her laughter died away, her expression turned to a thoughtful frown, as she recalled her earlier conversation with Rarity. Deciding now was as good a time as any, Twilight steeled herself and gathered her courage, before taking a deep breath. "Say, Darren?" she began, trying to fight down the butterflies in her stomach, and suppress the blush rapidly overtaking her face. "Yes, milady?" Darren asked, looking down into her eyes again, and causing her to promptly turn her gaze to the ground between her hoofs to hide her nervous expression and reddening features. "Well, I was just wondering if maybe we could go out sometime? Just the two of us," Twilight forced out, her face feeling like it was on fire. "Strictly as friends, of course," she added swiftly, hoping Darren wouldn't ask about how her voice had gone from an embarrassed squeak to a businesslike assertion in the space of barely 3 sentences. Fortunately, Darren seemed not to notice as he slowly nodded. "That sounds lovely, milady. I have the next day or so off, so it should work out well, but if I may offer a suggestion? Darren asked, his agreement sounding like honey to Twilight's ears. Uh-huh. Twilight replied dreamily, her heart on cloud nine from the idea that even if it wasn't a date, Darren had still said yes. Why don't we go tomorrow, and bring little Flurry Heart along? Not to put too fine a point on it, but Lord Shining Armor, and Lady Cadenza, look like they could use some time to themselves, Darren stated with a smile, as he recalled his own first years as a parent. Twilight, however, seemed to have missed the signs as she gave him a questioning look. What do you mean? Darren gave a heartfelt chuckle as he explained. Well, having a newborn around is a trying experience. It is a magical event like no other, but exhausting in the extreme. To any pony who has been a parent, the signals are obvious. Their manes were rather untidy, they had circles under their eyes, they smelled faintly of spit up, sweat, and other less savory aromas. What they require more than anything is a day to unwind, and catch up on their sleep. He explained, clearly speaking from experience, as Twilight nodded her understanding. You have a point. I didn't really notice it when we were talking with them, but you're right. Shining and Cadence are a wreck. But are you sure you don't mind? Twilight asked. She liked the idea, and felt confident she could persuade her brother and sister-in-law to go along with it, especially since she felt certain that Rarity and Starlight were already chatting them up about the alien hero of Ponyville. However, Twilight couldn't help but feel like this was taking advantage of Darren, even if it had been his suggestion. But he simply laughed. Not in the least, besides, I was in their shoes once, it would be the height of callousness not to offer my assistance. Especially as I feel certain that having a Seraphim newborn adds a whole new dimension of parental strain, he stated calmly. Twilight smiled broadly and nodded before her expression again became one of thoughtfulness. Darren? She asked, glancing up at him with a curious expression as they walked. Yes, m'lady? Darren responded with his usual air of calm affability. What exactly does it mean when you call Alicorn Seraphim? Twilight asked, her voice indicating that this was a question that clearly had been weighing on her for some time. Darren gave Twilight an appraising look, considering the question for some time before he responded, his words slow and reverent as he explained. Among the people of Dnua there is an ancient legend of the light. Essentially, the primal force of creation, purity, and good. The legend goes, that when the light first dawned upon existence, it was heralded by its first children, the Seraphim. These creatures were so beautiful, they could blind you with their presence alone. So wise, that they could settle any dispute without bloodshed. So kind, that even the blackest heart could not help but be moved by them. So pure, that even the most vile of corruptions would be banished by their merest touch. Said to be the avatars of the light itself, the legend states they were created to protect mankind, and guide us away from the predations of darkness and evil. Most believe the legend to be nothing more than a myth. A fairy tale for children. I was one such in fact, until I came here. However, to answer your actual question, I suppose the best definition would be, goddess. Though it more accurately translates as, holiest of the holy. Twilight's eyes widened in response to Darren's explanation, despite having suspected much of it. But? I mean, you know I'm not a goddess, right? Twilight asked, trying, and failing, to inflect the question as humorous. Darren simply gave Twilight a supremely gentle smile. If you mean, though I realize you are not omnipotent? Then yes, I am aware. But to my mind you nonetheless bear the mark of divinity. Twilight's eyes widened even further as she realized that Darren was being completely serious. He actually thought of her as a goddess. Suddenly all his strange behavior toward her, and the Alicorns in general, made perfect sense. Twilight suddenly felt slightly dizzy, it was hard enough adjusting to being a princess, now she suddenly found herself upgraded to goddess. What's worse was that it wasn't even remotely true. She wasn't divine. She was just her. She didn't want to argue with Darren, nor did she want to tell him what to believe, but this was too much. Darren. I don't know what you think I am, or what you think I can do, but I'm not a goddess. I'm not perfect, heck I can't even manage to cook dinner for Pony's sake. I'm not an avatar of the light or whatever else, I wasn't meant to lead mankind away from evil. For crying out loud, I didn't even know humans existed till I ended up turned into one after going through a magic mirror that led to another dimension. Twilight paused to take a breath as she realized she was borderline shouting. Taking a sympathetic tone, Twilight glanced up at Darren, sadness etched on her face. I'm not what you think I am, Darren, and if that's why you are being so subservient, then I need to ask that you stop. Because I don't deserve it. Twilight finished, hanging her head with the expression of some pony who has been forced to relate an unpleasant truth. Darren, however, just chuckled, shaking his head. Kneeling down, he bid Twilight to look up, as he pointed in the direction of Ponyville. Tell me, milady, what do you see? Darren asked with a small smile on his face. Twilight gave him a confused look. He was taking her refusion of his beliefs remarkably well. Ponyville. Why? She said flatly. Darren simply continued to smile as mischief danced in his eyes. Yes. A town like any other in Equestria then? He inquired, with the air of some pony who knows more than he's letting on. Well, yeah, why? Twilight asked, arching an eyebrow in a faint get-on-with-it manner. Well, it's not like any town I ever encountered on Dnoa. Where are the beggar ponies? Where are the beaten-down expressions of those living payday to payday just barely getting by? Where are the ponies who never go anywhere unarmed, out of paranoid fear of attack by their fellows? Where are the drunks? The destitute? The sick and the weak? Where are the prejudices between ponies over basic differences? Where is the mistrust for their leaders? Where is the poverty, the crime, and the corruption? Twilight stared at Darren in shock. Was that really what human cities and towns were like? Darren gave Twilight a faintly superior smirk, as her expression answered his questions without her needing to say a word. It is not here, nor is it to be found in any city, town, or kingdom in Equestria. Yes, ponies have their conflicts, no, they are not perfect, and yes, they are capable of cruelty and evil like any other race, yet. Darren let the last word hang in the air for a moment before continuing. Yet, unlike humans, your first response to problems is to meet them with understanding and dialogue. The predominant emotions in Equestria are love, tolerance, and kindness. You refrain from crimes not out of fear of the law, but because you care about each other. There are exceptions, of course. But what is pertinent, is that they are the exception, as opposed to the rule. Milady, where you see an ordinary town, I see a paradise earthed. Darren explained, in a voice of wondering admiration. Twilight balked. That hardly makes me a goddess. She protested, to which Darren once again gave a knowing smile. How many times have you saved this world, milady? 3? 4? And without spilling even a single drop of blood? I certainly could not have achieved such a result, Darren said in a musing tone. That was just Twilight began before Darren interrupted. And how many villains have you, and your friends managed to reform? Including, apparently, Discord. A being whom I would have labeled as utterly unrepentant. He asked casually. Twilight shook her head. That still doesn't make me, or any other alicorn, a goddess. You're wrong, she said sympathetically, but firmly. Darren shook his head. Milady, do you not see? It is not a matter of whether you are truly a seraph or not. It is a matter of whether you demonstrate the qualities of one. Divinity is not a thing you are born with, it is a thing that is earned through deeds and actions. In my time I have fought creatures with the power to level mountains with a wave of a hand, the ability to make the sky rain fire, or even bring the dead back to life. Yet, even in the face of such power, I never once felt those monsters divine. They had power obviously, but power alone is not enough. Darren stared into Twilight's eyes so she could see the absolute certainty in his face. The power to create a paradise with nothing more than applications of wisdom, kindness, tolerance, And love? That is a power that reaches beyond mortal limits, and any with that power, they alone have earned the right to bear the title of Seraphim. Twilight's words caught in her throat, her protest dying on her lips. So what about Flurry Heart then? She was born an alicorn. Twilight asked, her tone now one of curiosity, rather than dissent. She still felt Darren was wrong, and that he was giving her and the other princesses far more credit than they deserved. But his explanation made it clear that no amount of protest, even from her, would change his mind. However, regardless, she still wished to understand his reasoning. Darren smiled as he stood up straight, staring into the clouds with an unreadable expression. I suppose, that is where faith enters into the equation. Flurry Heart was indeed born as a seraph, but I have faith, that in time, she will prove herself deserving of the mantle. I also believe her birth to be a sign of great things to come. You could say I consider her to be a sacred omen. I feel an immense destiny awaits her, and that her birth heralds the coming of a tremendous future. Darren glanced down the road with a faraway look in his eyes. I serve the seraphs because they have demonstrated through power, and actions, that they are worthy of veneration. You, have given me more than I could ever repay, and far more than I deserve, asking for nothing in return. I believe in the Seraphim, and I believe in the ponies of this world. I believe, I was given a second chance when I found myself in this magnificent realm. A chance to serve a greater purpose. A chance to atone, to do things right this time. Twilight looked up at Darren, wondering what he could be referring to. It sounded like he felt he had done something wrong, committed some kind of sin. Yet everything Twilight knew about Darren, argued that he had always been a good stallion, so what was it he thought he was guilty of? Twilight said nothing as Darren continued to stare out into the distance, as if seeing a different world. After a minute or so of silence Darren shook his head. Forgive me, milady, I seem to have become momentarily lost in my own thoughts. Shall we continue? He asked with a smile. Twilight nodded, though she couldn't help but notice that Darren's smile seemed slightly pained. Right, don't want to keep shining, and Cadence waiting. She replied, deciding that now was not the time to try prying again into Darren's past, he would tell her when he was ready. Regardless, as Twilight stepped forward she considered what Darren had just told her, and the arguments he made, not just now, but since their first fateful meeting. And recalled Rarity's words. Wisdom, Twilight whispered under her breath. I'm sorry, milady. Darren asked, glancing at her in mild confusion. Twilight simply shook her head. It's nothing, just talking to myself. She replied. Darren nodded. As you say, milady. He responded as they walked the rest of the way in silence. Rarity smiled as she sipped her tea. Next to her sat a slightly nervous-looking Starlight Glimmer who had been unconsciously fidgeting with her mane since they had all sat down. Shortly after they had reached the castle and helped the guests unpack. Rarity had suggested they all sit down for tea, a snack, and an explanation of the ancient alien warrior from beyond the veil of time and space. Spike was currently busy in the kitchen, so that had left Rarity and Starlight to do all the explaining while Twilight was away. Now, after completing the story to the best of their ability, they watched from across the table. As the royal family of the Crystal Empire digested what they had just been told. Eyes wide, and with their own teacups lying forgotten in front of them. It's a lot to take in, Cadence stated after hearing Rarity describe, among other things, her eyewitness account of Darren's battle with the Timber Wolves. Starlight nodded her understanding. Believe me, we know, Darren has a pretty overwhelming resume. But trust me, he's easily the most honorable, and kind-hearted pony you could ever meet, she declared. Did you really see him fight off 100 timber wolves, by himself? Shining asked, suddenly feeling simultaneously incredulous, and slightly self-conscious. Well, honestly, darling, there were so many of those ghastly creatures it was hard to tell, but I would say it was at least that many. Rarity replied matter-of-factly, to Shining's unspoken astonishment. And the dragons? That really happened?" he asked, clearly struggling to even imagine such a thing. "Yep, the whole town saw it. He saved Twilight's life that day, along with everyone else." Starlight answered, none too subtly highlighting that Darren was the only reason they weren't all attending a mass funeral right now. Shining nodded slowly. "I guess we really need to thank him for that, don't we?" he said lamely, still overwhelmed by the idea that his little sister now had the single most devastating warrior he ever heard of, as a bodyguard/servant. "He'll insist he doesn't need it, but that would be the polite thing to do," Starlight replied. "And just wait till you taste his cooking, that stallion is a maestro in the kitchen." Cadence managed a smile, as her friend's praise bordered on the effusive. "You certainly seem impressed by him, Starlight." Cadence observed the hesitation in her voice, barely noticeable. Starlight replied with a nervous laugh. "Well, honestly, until I actually connected with him, I was his harshest critic. But once I had a chance to get to know him, I realized I was just acting paranoid. Probably still a little jumpy from that whole chrysalis almost taking over Equestria thing," she explained, taking a big gulp of tea to forestall any further questions. Cadence sensed there was more to the story but let it pass without comment. "What about you, Rarity? What was your first meeting with him like?" she asked curiously. Rarity laughed. "Oh darling, terrifying," she said with a wide smile as she recalled the event. "He scared me out of my wits with the way he looked, especially in that dreadful armor of his. But he was such a gentlecolt, and so chivalrous. He's just like the knights I read about in storybooks when I was a little filly," Rarity stated with a sigh of nostalgia. Cadence nodded in response. "Flurry certainly seems to like him, but he appeared rather surprised by her," the Crystal Monarch offered diplomatically. Starlight nodded with a slightly nervous chuckle. Well, he swore some kind of an oath to serve the alicorns, which he refers to as the Seraphim. We don't know why, but he seems to borderline worship you guys. I guess seeing a pony who was born as an alicorn rather than ascending to become one, overwhelmed him a bit," she offered, trying hard not to let on that she knew more than she was telling. Cadence gave Starlight a surprised glance. "He swore an oath to serve the alicorns? When did that happen?" Cadence asked, confusion etched on her features. Starlight shrugged. "Sometime during his last visit here, a little over 1,000 years ago. He hasn't been very specific about things," Starlight explained as she snatched a scone from a plate on the table. "Do you think he's hiding something?" Shining asked, unable to disguise the hint of suspicion in his voice. Rarity shook her head. "Oh no darling, he just made a promise to Celestia and Luna to keep it a secret. Once he sees them, I am certain he'll tell us the whole story," she explained, taking another sip of her own tea. Shining nodded, though he still looked a little worried. However, any further questions were postponed by the sound of the door to the living room opening. Twilight entered wearing a smile that practically glowed, followed by Darren, who sported his typical gentle grin on his face. The instant the Doomslayer entered the room, Flurry flew from her mother to perch happily on his shoulder. He looked momentarily surprised for an instant before his smile returned, and he tousled the young alicorn's mane affectionately and with a gentleness very much at odds with the warrior he had been described as. "Why hello little one, it is a pleasure to see you again as well," Darren greeted the young alicorn, as Flurry gave a small giggle and nuzzled his cheek in response. Glancing over at Cadence and Shining Armor, Darren gave a welcoming smile. "Lady Cadenza, Lord Armor, I trust you are settling in?" he asked sincerely. Cadence nodded. "Yes, thank you, Everpony was just telling us about you," she explained. "All baseless slander, I assure you," Darren replied smoothly with a mischievous grin. Earning a heartfelt laugh from Everpony present, and nicely dissipating the small amount of tension in the room. However, as the laughter died down, Cadence and Shining Armor's expressions became more serious, and for a moment it seemed they were about to express some form of distrust for Darren. However, instead they each inclined their heads slightly in a gesture of respect. "Thank you, Mr. Grandel, for saving my little sister and her friends. We owe you more than we could ever possibly repay," Shining stated formally. "If there is ever anything you need, or want from us, then consider it yours," Cadence agreed feelingly. But as they had been told to expect, Darren simply smiled as he shook his head. "You owe me nothing, I simply did what my oaths and the situation demanded. Service to Equestria is all the reward I require. But I thank you both for your kind words," Darren replied, inclining his head slightly, as he could not bow without disturbing Flurry Heart. Shining shook his head in amazement. "Wow, you really do sound like a knight. Any interest in joining the Royal Guard?" he joked. "A tempting offer, but regrettably I am already happily employed at Lady Applejack's farm," Darren explained with a chuckle. "Oh, how wonderful! I take it you're having an easy time adjusting then?" Cadence asked with a smile. "Indeed, milady, I have been made to feel most welcome," Darren replied with a nod, before glancing at the clock and holding up a hand. "Forgive me, Everpony, but I am afraid I must cut this short as I have to prepare dinner." Cadence and Shining glanced at Darren in surprise. "Oh, please don't go through any trouble on our account," Cadence protested. After all she had heard, it seemed clear that they should be treating Darren to dinner, not the other way around. But Darren simply smiled. "It is no trouble whatsoever, milady, I actually quite enjoy it," he declared smoothly. "Lady Rarity, will you be joining us?" he asked before Cadence could offer any further objection. Rarity glanced briefly at Twilight, who nodded enthusiastically, and inwardly Rarity jumped for joy. She had heard amazing things about Darren's prowess in the kitchen from Twilight, and being able to sample his cooking in the presence of such august company was an opportunity not to be missed. "I would love to, darling," she stated gratefully. Darren simply nodded. "Then I shall begin at once," he said as he gently transferred Flurry Heart from his shoulder to Cadence's hooves. Surprisingly, Flurry held out her hooves to Darren with an expression that was nothing short of heartrending. Clearly having grown quite fond of the spot on the Doomed Slayer she had claimed for herself. Now, little one, no need for that," Darren stated with a grin, giving Flurry a reassuring pat on the head and causing her to smile again. "I promise to return, as soon as dinner is ready." Flurry gave a slight pout, causing Darren to laugh. "Very well then, how does this sound? You be a good little foal, and I promise to fix you something special for dessert?" To the surprise of Everpony save Darren, Flurry nodded, clapping her hooves and giving a gurgling coo. Darren smiled as he stood up and walked away with a chuckle. No matter the world, no matter the age and time, one thing shall always remain true. Reaching the door, he paused to glance over his shoulder with a wide grin. "Children will always love sweets." Twilight smiled as she headed to bed, reflecting happily on the evening. After a fabulous dinner of vegetable paella, a white cheese tart, hot pot soup, and a magnificent salad with a spicy Italian dressing, Darren had presented a creme brulee with sliced strawberries, and blueberries to Everpony, and as an additional touch, had used the fruits to make a smiling face on the one belonging to Flurry Heart. The meal had been praised endlessly, both at the table, and in the drawing room where they had enjoyed a lovely green tea as they talked into the night. Most of the conversation had been directed toward Darren, who had accepted the praise, and questions, with his typical degree of humility, and good humor. Spike had also at one point, regaled them all with his version of how he had saved the Crystal Empire, and they had all applauded his performance, and his courage. It was a truly wonderful night, and had only been made better by the knowledge that tomorrow she, Flurry Heart, and Darren would be spending the entire day together. As Twilight expected, it hadn't taken much to convince her brother, and Cadence to give their permission to take Flurry with them. Darren had been right, they were clearly burnt out, and seemed immensely grateful for the break. Whatever apprehensions they may have felt about Darren had, for the most part, vanished. His charm, kindness, and gentle nature having left them with nothing but praise for the strange alien. What's more, Twilight had found the first reason for why she found Darren so irresistible. Twilight had always been an intelligent pony, some might even say genius. But she had never really been wise. Wisdom was often far more ephemeral than intelligence, and thus harder to grasp. Twilight had once read that intelligence was knowing how to move a mountain, but wisdom was knowing whether the mountain should be moved in the first place. Twilight had mastery of dozens of scientific and magical disciplines, but she sometimes lacked the insight that Darren seemed to possess. Granted, Darren wasn't perfect about it, he definitely had difficulty seeing things clearly when he felt his friends were threatened. His reaction to discord proved that. But at the same time, he had been willing to defer to others on occasions where he might not have all the nuances of the situation. Highlighted by the fact that he had refrained from turning discord into paste at Twilight's word. Darren had a knack for seeing things in a manner that others may not have considered. He looked beyond the immediately obvious, and saw what lay underneath with an immense degree of clarity. Celestia had a similar gift, and Twilight had always felt drawn to it. So much so, in fact, that Twilight had at times wondered if she had a crush on her teacher. A thought that she had swiftly buried at the time, but now suddenly seemed slightly less crazy, though, only slightly. So yes, she was drawn to Darren's wisdom. But, as much as Twilight hated to admit it, that wasn't enough to build a relationship on. She needed more. Falling into her bed and breathing in the cedar scent of the fresh linens, Twilight took solace in the knowledge that she had at least found one good reason for her affection. And as she drifted off to Luna's realm, she found herself hopeful that others would arise. So good, was all Cadence could manage to say, as she stuffed her face with Darren's latest masterpiece. Crepes, rolled up, and stuffed with raspberries, blackberries, blueberries, and strawberries, then covered heavily in a sauce made from sweet cream cheese. In addition, Darren had made fresh blueberry muffins, with butter. And to wash it all down, he had put out fresh orange juice, along with Trottingham breakfast tea, or for those who wanted something a bit stronger, coffee. Darren simply chuckled as he carefully fed Flurry Heart her meal of mashed fruits mixed with cream. An old comedian recipe for baby food, that Flurry devoured with an eagerness that exceeded even her mother's. "You honor me, Seraph Cadenza," Darren stated happily, as he offered Flurry another spoonful of her food, that vanished as soon as it was brought within her reach. "Easy, little one, you must learn to eat in a manner becoming of a seraphim, just look at." Darren began, before glancing around to see Twilight licking her plate, her face covered in berry juice, while Cadence had stuffed her mouth so full she could no longer close it. Meanwhile, Shining Armor had followed his wife's example and filled his face far too full to speak, as Starlight and Spike all but declared war over the last crepe on the tray that had once held dozens of them. Never mind, perhaps you should simply eat how you wish," Darren stated with a small smile, as Flurry giggled in response. Darren laughed softly, as he offered up yet another spoonful of berry paste to the young alicorn. Enjoying the sensation, however brief it may be, of being a caregiver again. But as he fed the young alicorn, his mind halfway between the present and his past memories, Darren was pulled wholly into the former by a strange sound. It had initially started low, hence the reason it took a moment to register, but was slowly building to ever greater volume. The ponies at the table had not yet noticed the discrepancy, as they were still mired in conversation and food, but that would hold true for only a moment longer. Centuries of finely honed battle instincts and development of near constant situational awareness, told Darren everything he needed to know. As he cast aside the spoon he held, and ran toward the wall behind Flurry's high chair. Jumping up, he placed his foot on the wall, his knee bent. Tensing mystically enhanced muscles, Darren pushed off with enough of his strength to sail elegantly over the table, and land between it and an open window overlooking Ponyville. No longer wearing his armor, Darren's strength and defenses may have been reduced, but his agility and speed had increased substantially. Nevertheless, he made it just in time, as a gray mare in a male pony's uniform came hurtling through the window in an uncontrolled tailspin, screaming a warning as she went. Setting his feet, the doomed slayer caught the mare as if he had done this 100 times before. Pivoting on one foot, Darren allowed her momentum to bleed off by spinning around several times, before neatly setting her down on the ground. The mare's cap flew off during the last rotation, but had not escaped the Doomslayer's notice. Snatching her hat out of the air before it landed in Cadence's tee, Darren swiftly brushed it off and set it back on the blonde-maned mare's head in one simple movement. "Good morning, Lady Hooves, are you all right?" Darren asked, looking down at the slightly frazzled mare with a welcoming smile. Shining Armor and Cadence stopped chewing to stare at Darren in open-mouthed amazement at his incredible acrobatic display. While Derpy Hooves looked up at her savior with a grateful, if cross-eyed, smile. "Gee, thanks, Mr. Darren, I almost made a mess again, didn't I?" she asked sheepishly, seemingly treating Darren's remarkable save as an everyday occurrence. Darren laughed, no doubt Derpy was referring to their first meeting earlier that week, when she had smashed through a window before turning a very nice antique table into kindling, fortunately with only minor injuries. Afterward the two had struck up a conversation, and in the short time they had spoken, Darren had found the male pony to be a pleasant and engaging individual. "It is of no concern, as long as you are all right. Structures can be rebuilt, crops regrown, and coin re-earned, but a life can never be replaced," Darren said simply. Derpy nodded. She really liked Darren, even if she didn't know him that well. He was a super smart pony, and always so nice. More than that though, she appreciated how he hadn't looked down on her because she was clumsy. Plus he looked really good today. Dressed in a black vest, black silk tie, and white collared dress shirt. He wore a black tailcoat over it all, with silver buttons and a silver chain loop attached to the side of the coat, hooking over the bottom button. Wearing black formal dress pants, and shine dress shoes, and with his hair in a neat ponytail, he looked like a fashion model playing at being a butler. He even had on a pair of white gloves. "Thanks, Mr. Darren, I like your outfit a lot," Derpy replied earnestly, as she took in his full ensemble. Darren gave out a brief laugh. "Thank you, m'lady, I wasn't entirely sold on the look, but I must admit it has grown on me," he stated before motioning to an empty chair. "Would you care to join us for a few minutes?" he asked, noticing Derpy staring past him at the small pile of homemade muffins on the table. "Can I?" she asked, suddenly sounding as excited as a foal on hearth's warming eve. Smiling broadly, Darren turned to regard Twilight, who was trying hard not to act jealous at Derpy's interactions with Darren. Logically she knew Darren just liked Derpy as an acquaintance, and for her part Derpy was just being polite, but despite that it still annoyed her. However, Twilight couldn't really blame Derpy. When Twilight herself had first seen Darren sporting his latest rarity original, she had needed to go back to her room for a very cold shower before she could even say good morning. "M'lady Twilight?" Darren repeated, abruptly bringing her back to the present, where she had apparently missed a question. "I'm sorry, what?" she asked. "I was asking if you have any objection to Lady Hooves joining us for breakfast," Darren repeated calmly. Oh no, not at all, take a seat, Derpy, help yourself to whatever you like," Twilight responded, trying not to let a note of insincerity creep into her voice. Though, had Twilight taken a bit more time to analyze things, she might have noticed that the gray male pony was far more enamored with the food on display than with Darren. Derpy all but jumped for joy as she took a seat, and placed 2 large muffins on her plate. Meanwhile, Shining Armor, finally having chewed his food enough to swallow, shook his head at Darren in amazement. "Wow, Darren, I don't think I've ever seen some pony without wings move like that. Forget the Royal Guard, you ought to be a superhero," he remarked with a laugh. Glancing up at the prince, Darren gave a small chuckle. "Much though I appreciate the praise, my lord, I don't think I'm quite qualified for something like that." "Oh come on, you got the hero reflex down pat, you should at least consider it," Shining replied with a grin, to which Darren responded with a shrug. "Unfortunately, my lord, hero reflex notwithstanding, I would look absolutely appalling in spandex and a cape." Shining Armor laughed briefly before turning to face Spike. "Why don't we get a second opinion from an expert? Spike, you read comics, do you think Darren would make a good superhero?" In response to the prince's query, Spike set aside his orange juice before looking Darren up and down with a critical eye. Honestly, Darren seems more the anti-hero type to me. You can't see it when he's out of his armor, but when I first saw him he reminded me of Gothic Knight a little," Spike opined matter-of-factly. Shining immediately arched an eyebrow. "What, seriously? Gothic Knight? That deranged pony with the scarred face from the Dread Heart comics? Who beats evil ponies within an inch of their lives with hooves shod in iron? That's nuts. I think he seems more like Captain Light. Remember in issue 47? As Spike and Shining Armor continued their debate over what superhero he most resembled, Darren headed back to finish feeding Flurry with a chuckle, only to discover her licking an empty bowl clean of its contents. Now only the stains on her coat and mane attested to the bowl ever having contained anything at all. Pinching the bridge of his nose, Darren let out a heavy sigh. So, in the present-day Equestria, etiquette has been forcibly abandoned, superhero literature is discussed in the courts of royalty, and visitors to the Seraphim are permitted to barge in at any time for any reason, without an appointment or escort, he stated evenly, even as he hid a smile. "Is that bad?" Cadence asked in a slightly wary tone of voice. Glancing up, Darren was about to reply when he froze, staring at the high chair before him. The smile on his face turning to a look of pure shock, as he felt a painful ache in his chest. There he saw her, she couldn't have been older than 3. With hair like fire she giggled, and smiled up at him with ice blue eyes. Darren fought to control himself, as he was once more confronted with a face that even 1,000 years of battle and madness couldn't wipe from his mind. She was Darren's greatest creation. The one, truly good thing, he had ever made. She laughed, and held out her arms, indicating she wished to be picked up, and despite himself, Darren moved to reach out to her. Then, as swiftly as it came, the illusion vanished, and Flurry Heart now stood in place of the small human, who had been there not a moment before, in an identical pose. Shaking off his momentary shock, and swiftly mastering the tears that threatened to overtake him, Darren gently obeyed Flurry's unspoken request. The sharp pain in his heart strangely lessened, as he lifted her up and brought her close. Cradling the young seraph in his arms, Darren looked up at Cadence with a smile that only partly concealed the hurt in his eyes, before replying. "Not at all, m'lady. In fact, I think it's perfect." An hour later, Darren stood in the main entranceway of the castle with Twilight at his side. Twilight was almost vibrating with excitement as he listened intently to Cadence and Shining. "And this is her whammy," Cadence explained, a stuffed snail contained in her aqua magic aura. "If she starts to get out of control, just give her this and she'll calm right down," she explained, Darren nodding as he carefully placed the stuffed toy in a large bag. "Understood, m'lady," Darren replied, standing ramrod straight, and sounding as if he were a soldier receiving his marching orders. This attitude of discipline was undercut only slightly by the presence of Flurry Heart perching on his shoulder playing with the black ribbon that held his ponytail in place. "Now as to food," Cadence began before Darren interrupted with an upraised hand. "Already covered, m'lady," he stated, opening his bag to reveal several small jars of his own homemade baby food tucked inside. "I made extra in anticipation of this outing, but if you believe it to be insufficient, I will fetch more," Darren explained. Cadence was impressed. Before they had even started having this conversation, Darren had prepared a bag of everything that would be needed for a day out with a baby. Diapers, food, extra diapers, blanket, emergency extra diapers, carrying sling, toys. He was actually more on top of things than Cadence was. "Wow, Darren, if I didn't know better, I would think you've done this before," Shining commented with a laugh. Darren smiled. "I pride myself on planning ahead, m'lord," he replied, refraining from mentioning that he had in fact done this before, so as not to get bogged down in a discussion of his prior life. Shining chuckled. "No need to be so formal, you can just call me Shining," he replied with a smile. Reflecting that it hadn't taken him, or Cadence for that matter, long to start treating Darren as if he had always been part of their lives. He was every bit as polite, dutiful, and kind-hearted as Rarity and Starlight had said. Shining was still a little confused by some of Darren's behavior, his first reaction to Flurry for example, but all things considered Shining felt Darren had earned his trust. "As you wish, Lord Shining," Darren replied, without even a trace of irony in his voice. Shining shook his head with a faint smile. Twilight had mentioned Darren had once been a soldier, and his constant formality certainly seemed to back that up. Shining seriously wondered what kind of military Darren had originally served in. Based on his display earlier when he caught Derpy, and what he had been told by Twilight and her friends, whomever they were, they would have eaten the Royal Guard for breakfast. It occurred to Shining, and not for the first time, that if he had even 100 stallions like Darren, he would never need to worry about creatures like Queen Chrysalis and Tyark ever again. However, before he could think to ask any pertinent questions, Shining was abruptly broken out of his musings by the sound of his wife's voice. "Well, I think that's everything," she stated before levitating her daughter off Darren's shoulder to give her a kiss on each cheek. "Love you, sweetie, you be a good little fool for Darren and Auntie Twilight, okay?" Flurry replied with a giggle. Moving over to his wife's side, Shining ruffled Flurry's mane before also kissing her cheek. "Don't cause any trouble, okay kiddo?" he remarked, trying to stifle the slight worry in his voice. Again Flurry giggled as she was levitated back onto Darren's shoulder. And Shining tried to ignore the twinge in his heart at the separation, reminding himself that, based on what he had heard and seen, Flurry had the single most powerful bodyguard in Equestria watching over her. Not to mention his own sister, who in addition to being an alicorn, was an immensely talented mage. If they couldn't keep Flurry safe, no pony could. However, even logically knowing all the reasons he shouldn't worry, Shining was a father, and no father, or mother, is ever completely comfortable letting his or her child out of their sight. "Rest assured, Lord Shining, Lady Cadence, I shall guard Miss Flurry as if she were my own flesh and blood, I give you my absolute word," Darren stated, his voice easily conveying that his promise was as far from empty as it was possible to be. Twilight nodded. "Don't worry, big bro, Flurry's in good hooves, and good hands. Aren't you, sweetie?" Twilight stated as she levitated Flurry down to nuzzle her affectionately. Flurry giggled and squeaked happily at the attention from her aunt, as Darren nodded his agreement. "Indeed, please take the time we are gone to relax. Master Spike and Lady Starlight promised to see to lunch in my absence, and we will meet you for dinner later." Cadence and Shining nodded. "Right, we'll see you later then, and thank you both for doing this. We really did need a chance to catch our breath," Shining remarked. Darren nodded. "Children are among the most exhausting of blessings, but I assure you, it does get easier," he replied with a knowing smile. Shining nodded, then suddenly froze, an expression of shock overtaking his features. Glancing at Cadence, he saw a similarly surprised look on his wife's face. "Darren, have you ever?" he began, only to stop when he turned back to see Darren and Twilight were already walking away. "So, m'lady, what did you want to do first?" Darren inquired as they reached the edge of town, attracting looks of pleasant surprise. And in Darren's case, a few of intense longing from one or two of the mares who caught sight of him. Twilight pointedly ignored these looks, despite them being far fewer in number than they had been, as ponies grew used to Darren's unarmored presence. "Well, I thought first we could visit the market. I need to pick up an order of alchemy ingredients, plus I wanted to get something for Applejack, her birthday is coming up in a few months." Twilight replied, fighting down a flare of jealousy as a mare with a green coat and yellow mane waved to Darren with a come-hither look on her face. Darren, however, simply returned the wave with a smile, and continued walking. "Excellent choice. I myself need to find a gift for Lady Fluttershy to apologize for my behavior the other day. And as long as you have mentioned it, I should also seek an appropriate gift for Lady Applejack," he replied. Moving through the town, they soon arrived at the newly rebuilt market. Some areas were still under construction, but the vast majority of damage from Garble's attack had been repaired, and the shops and stalls were doing a lively business. Leading the way, Twilight brought them to a store whose sign proclaimed it, the Spice Rack. Normally, Twilight got her potion-making materials from Zekara, but there were some harder-to-find ingredients, that even the zebra mystic couldn't cultivate. The Spice Rack, true to its name, mostly dealt in exotic herbs and spices for consumption, but the store owner also had a fair supply of purely alchemical ingredients, not to mention connections to various suppliers all across Equestria. And Zekara had advised Twilight to go to him if she needed something especially rare. Heading inside, the trio heard a bell chime, causing the proprietor to glance up from the customer he was helping. His eyes widened as he saw the figure of Darren Grandel walk into his shop with Flurry Heart perched on his shoulder, and Twilight at his side. "Princess Twilight, and Darren Grandel," he stated in awe, before rushing out from behind the counter to greet the Doomslayer, abandoning his current patron in his haste. "To think the hero of Ponyville would grace my store with his presence," he gushed, shaking Darren enthusiastically by the hand. He had an olive green coat, and short red mane, as well as a cutie mark displaying a hot pepper, and on his upper lip sat a perfectly trimmed mustache. His bright yellow-orange eyes looked at Darren with an odd expression as he spoke. "Chipotle pepper at your service, what can I get for you?" Darren opened his mouth to reply when a loud and overly theatrical voice cut him off. "Excuse me. But the great and powerful Trixie was here first, and she does not." The pony, a mare with a light blue coat, silver mane with gray highlights, and an almost comical wizard hat and cape, stopped dead when she saw Darren. Her mouth falling open, and her bright purple eyes bugging out for a moment in panic before her gaze fell on Twilight. Twilight smiled smugly at Trixie, as for several seconds her ex-antagonist struggled to form words. "What?" was all she managed to get out after several moments of trying. She had of course heard of Darren Grandel. Since returning from a show in Manhattan 2 days ago, he was all any pony talked about. She had heard dozens of outrageous stories of a legendary alien stallion who saved Ponyville from dragons and timberwolves, including from the proprietor of this store. And had not believed a word of it. Now faced with him in the flesh, she suddenly found herself reconsidering her position. "Oh hey Trixie," Twilight said casually, as though nothing at all was out of the ordinary. Struggling to pretend not to enjoy seeing her former enemy so completely wrong-hoofed. "How was Manhattan?" Trixie would normally have responded with a thinly veiled insult, or arrogant exaggeration of her show's success, but now, all she could do was stare. However, at that moment Chipotle Pepper decided to interject. "This is the stallion I was discussing earlier with you, miss. Still think I was having you on?" he asked, glancing at Trixie with a faintly superior look. Trixie shook her head as Darren glanced down at the store proprietor. "Forgive me, Master Pepper, I am very pleased to meet you, and the warm welcome to your fine store is appreciated, but Lady Trixie was here before myself and Lady Twilight. Perhaps you could take care of her purchase before we proceed any further," he suggested gently. Chipotle glanced up at Darren then nodded. "Oh, yes, of course, you're quite right, Mr. Grandel, I'll take care of it straight away," he stated eagerly. Darren nodded his thanks as Chipotle finished ringing Trixie up. Breaking out of her stupor, Trixie took her package of spices, and placed them in the saddlebag she was wearing, before heading out the door as swiftly as dignity would permit. Twilight smirked inwardly, this non-date was off to a great start. "Now what can I get for you, Mr. Darren?" Chipotle asked, after taking a moment to place Trixie's bits in his register. "I am afraid I am just browsing, however Lady Twilight has come to pick up her order of alchemic ingredients." Darren responded with a smile and a gesture toward Twilight. "Ah yes, Princess Twilight, we just got your order in this morning, if you could sign for it." As Twilight moved toward the counter to conduct her transaction, Darren and Flurry glanced around the shelves filled with herbs, spices, and esoteric potion ingredients in large glass containers. "What do you think, Miss Flurry? See anything you like?" In response to his inquiry, Flurry jumped from his shoulder, flitting from one container to another before pointing at one filled with dark brown beans. Glancing at the label, Darren let out a laugh. "Cocoa beans." He read aloud. You want chocolate? He asked with an arched eyebrow. Flurry nodded. Well, clever fool, regrettably I do not have any on me. Flurry's face fell for an instant before he grinned. But, I will see what I can do. Flurry smiled and giggled happily, before returning to Darren's shoulder to nuzzle his cheek. However, at that moment his ears tuned into Twilight's confused voice. Are you sure this is right? Darren heard Twilight ask from behind him. Turning around, Darren saw the princess staring perplexed at a piece of paper that must have been her bill. This is barely a quarter of what these ingredients are worth, Twilight declared, questioningly glancing up at Chipotle. Oh, well, you know we're having a sale. He explained unconvincingly, his eyes flicking to Darren for an instant. But I ordered these specially, how can they be on sale? Twilight asked in confusion. Chipotle smiled at her for a moment before lowering his voice as Darren turned away again. Let's just say, I'm letting every pony who comes in for the next month, use a little credit from some pony else's account, and he has a lot of credit, he said with a wink. A look of comprehension flitted across Twilight's face as she nodded. Chipotle's shop had been partly destroyed during the dragon attack, and he was fully aware of who he owed for its swift repair. Not to mention whom he, and every pony else in town, owed their lives to. He also apparently knew that certain some pony, had a policy of not accepting payment or gifts for good deeds. Oh, that sale, right, now I remember, Twilight stated loudly, giving Chipotle a smile and a wink before hoofing over her bits, and placing her purchase in her saddlebags. Then glancing at Darren she put on the most innocent smile she could. Ready to go, Darren? Darren nodded slowly, not fooled for a moment by the act, however unwilling to make an issue of it, as refusing the gift now would have simply been rude. Indeed, milady, he said, standing aside to let Twilight go first. Following Twilight's lead, Darren paused at the door. Turning around he gave Chipotle a gentle smile. You have a good heart, Master Pepper, and I look forward to doing business with you again, he stated before vanishing out the door. Chipotle Pepper stared at the door with a smile. Hey, guess I should have known better than to think I could fool him, he chuckled to himself. A few hours later the trio found themselves sitting comfortably on the patio of a cafe, surrounded by bags containing their various purchases. After searching through several shops, Twilight and Darren had each found what they wanted. Twilight had located a beautifully made clock for Applejack. Made of lacquered oak with a face was carved into the shape of an apple tree, with apples arranged into a circle along the branches and the ground next to the trunk. The numbers denoting the hour having been carved into the wooden apple surface. Among the branches, and magnificently rendered leaves, were masterfully crafted images of birds, and bees, as well as a young filly asleep at the foot of the trunk. The artist had stained the wood in a variety of shades, subtly allowing the observer to easily view the disparate elements of the carving easily. Twilight had originally planned to get Applejack a book, but Darren advised that the clock would be better received, as a perfect blend of functional and decorative. Flurry had also expressed her approval, levitating it off the wall and into her aunt's face when she tried to argue, for which Darren rewarded her with a small piece of a chocolate bar he had bought earlier. Thus outnumbered, Twilight had agreed, though she had good-naturedly grumbled that turning her own niece against her was playing dirty. A comment Darren simply chuckled at. He had not known Applejack nearly as long as Twilight, but Darren had read his employer as a mayor who liked everything to have a practical purpose. Mindful of that fact, he settled on a set of cooking knives with wooden handles carved in the shape of various birds of prey. Next they had headed to a nearby tea shop, where Darren purchased several boxes of what Twilight had told him was Fluttershy's favorite tea. Darren had also acquired a set of 3 teacups, painted with delicate vines and roses, that Twilight assured him would be to Fluttershy's taste. Twilight marveled at how Darren managed to balance entertaining Flurry with his shopping so effortlessly. He generally allowed Flurry to explore unhindered, but was unafraid to lay down the law if he needed to. Such as when she had tried to get into the display of knives he was examining. Darren had been firm that she was forbidden to touch the blades, but at the same time was understanding of her wish to know the nature of the world around her. And allowed her to examine the knives under supervision, so her curiosity was sated and she felt no need to seek them out behind his back. In this and other ways, he was able to command Fleury's obedience without needing to raise his voice once. Now sitting in the cafe, Twilight found herself wondering if this was how Darren had been with his daughter on Dnua. As the waiter took their order, Darren reached into the baby bag resting next to his chair, fishing out a container of baby food and a spoon. Fleury, currently sequestered in an infant high chair borrowed from the restaurant, glanced longingly at the pocket of Darren's tailcoat that she knew contained a chocolate bar. Noticing the direction of the young alicorn's gaze, Darren smiled. "Not so fast, young miss, I swore to care for you as if you were my own, and that means making certain you eat more than just sugar." Fleury immediately countered with an expression of heart-melting puppy dog eyes, however this time the Doomslayer was unmoved. "Sorry little miss, but I'm afraid that in this case I must insist," Darren stated firmly, to which Fleury responded by folding her fore hooves and adopting an angry pout. "Why do I have this sudden inkling that you and Lady Rainbow Dash are reading from the same book?" Darren asked with a chuckle, as he offered Fleury a spoonful of the berry mix. Twilight laughed at Darren's comment, as Fleury displayed her displeasure by turning her nose up at the food being offered to her. Raising an eyebrow at Fleury's display of recalcitrance, Darren shot Twilight a surreptitious wink. "Well, if you are not hungry," Darren stated nonchalantly, as he began packing the food up again. Almost immediately Fleury switched from stubbornness to pleading as she saw the food being removed. "Oh? So, you are hungry then?" Darren asked in feigned confusion, to which Fleury nodded. "Are you certain? It will mean eating my cooking, you understand." Fleury hesitated for a moment before nodding again. "Well, I suppose, since you've been such a good foal today," Darren stated, inflecting it as if he was doing Fleury a favor. Giggling happily, Fleury nodded as Darren began to feed her. Twilight watched the exchange with a feeling of blissful detachment. As for an instant she imagined them all, not as her friend, and her niece, but as a married couple with their own daughter. For just a moment Twilight allowed herself to get lost in the fantasy. A feeling of euphoric joy washed over her as she felt a sense of completion she had never known could exist. She could see Darren glancing up from feeding their daughter, a gentle smile on his face as he said the 4 words she would never tire of. "Milady, are you all right?" Twilight felt her fantasy abruptly shattered by Darren's question. Embarrassed that she had let herself space out again in front of her crush. "Fine!" she nearly shouted. "Just admiring how good you are with children," she stated with a nervous laugh. Deciding to take Twilight's words at face value, Darren shrugged. "One of the benefits of a good memory, I suppose. I never seem to forget much of anything once I've learned it. Besides, when you raise a child for 12 years you tend to remember the basics." Darren's expression became briefly pained. "No matter how much time passes you never forget some things. Even if you want to." Both Twilight and Fleury could hear the sadness in his voice. It was impossible to miss. Despite Darren's clear attempts to hide it, his pain was palpable in a way that defied understanding. Twilight felt a distinct ache in her heart, at that moment, and wished with all her heart she could simply wrap her hooves around Darren, and stay like that until whatever pain he was feeling went away. But she couldn't. The best she could do was change the subject. Hey, I've been meaning to ask, how did you disable Discord's magic the other day?" Darren's expression swiftly became a smile, grateful for the distraction from his dark memories. "It is a simple spell that all the militaries and law enforcers on Dnua use. It's called the Null Spell," he explained as he continued to feed Fleury, and despite herself Twilight leaned in to hear better, fascinated. "How does it work?" she asked eagerly. "The basic explanation is that it creates a temporary zero magic field around the target, powered by the target's own magical energy. The spell only lasts for 5 minutes, but during that time they are utterly incapable of casting even the most basic of spells," Darren explained. "Unfortunately I was never much of a mage, so I do not know the exact specifics of the spell's function. Twilight nodded, trying not to look disappointed at Darren's admission of ignorance. Casting the spell is relatively simple once you know how. First, you must be within approximately 50 paces of the target, with clear line of sight. Second, you must make the proper invoking gesture. Finally, you speak the word, Zon, meaning forbiddance, along with the name of the target. Twilight nodded as she committed Darren's words to memory with the same enthusiasm she always did on learning a new spell. So you can take away any pony's magic that way? Twilight asked, incredulous. Darren shook his head. Not quite, there are a few limits, he cautioned. It only works on beings with a large degree of magical ability. For example, it will affect Discord, but it is highly unlikely that it will work on an average unicorn. In addition, you must know the target's actual name. It will not work if you address them by a pseudonym, title, or even a nickname, only the one given on their birth. In addition, it only lasts for 5 minutes exactly, and another casting will not reset that number unless the first has expired. Twilight nodded, as Darren finished. Anything else? She asked. Darren nodded as he finished feeding Flurry, and used a damp napkin to wipe her face clean. The range, if you can't close to at least 50 feet, the spell will fail, he stated. Well, even with those limits, that's an amazingly powerful spell, and you say it was common? Twilight asked, more than a little impressed. Darren nodded. Indeed, and for good reason. Long ago, Dnua was a world ruled by powerful mage lords. The lords constantly fought each other for power and territory, using spells of indescribable power in their bid for dominance. The common people were considered of no consequence to the mage lords, and time after time they found their cities and towns destroyed, and their friends and family slaughtered in the near-constant battles. Twilight's eyes widened in horror at the thought of magic, the force she had devoted her life to studying, being used to commit such atrocities. Darren noticed her expression and shook his head. Those were dark times, and my world bore the scars for millennia after. However, about 5,000 years before I was born, everything changed. You see, one day after a particularly terrible battle, a badly wounded mage lord wandered into a village. He was utterly helpless, his magic spent, and his army scattered. As you might imagine, many in the village wished for his death. Remembering the horrors inflicted upon them by the mage and his ilk, but the elder of the village forbid it. The elder was a frail old man, but his impassioned words stayed the villagers' hands. He said that if they killed the lord out of hate, that they would be no better than he. So it was that the townsfolk were convinced to nurse the lord back to health, little knowing what would come of that small act of mercy. For as it happened, this mage lord was none other than Ahriman the Eternal. Perhaps the mightiest mage of his time, and despite having committed many evils he was moved by the elder's kindness. When he had recovered, he sought out the elder, and offered him a single wish as repayment for his merciful act. The elder said, Lord Ahriman, I fear what I desire is not a thing that even one as great as you can give me. Ahriman replied, There is nothing that is beyond my reach, name your desire, and it shall be done. And so the elder told him, Lord Ahriman, what I desire is, peace. Not only for myself, but for all those in this world, be they mage or peasant. Wow! Twilight commented. So what did Ahriman do? Darren chuckled, Twilight and Flurry riveted to his every word. Well, Ahriman looked down at the elder and swore that he would find a way to grant his wish. He then left the village and returned to his stronghold, where he labored for 10 years to find an answer. Then on the 12th day of the final year he returned to the village with a gift. It was a spell that could be learned by anyone, even a child, but had the power to bring low even the mightiest mage. He taught the spell to the villagers, and then went from village to village, town to town, until all but the mage lords knew the spell by heart. Then he gathered his own army, augmented by the many peasants he had taught. He issued a challenge to all the mage lords the world over, declaring, I am Ahriman the Eternal, and I will soon enact a spell that shall make me a god. This is a warning to all those who would oppose me. Bow before me, or be destroyed. Wait. Why would Ahriman say something like that? I thought he promised to bring peace. Twilight asked, a note of anger in her voice at Ahriman's actions. Darren just smiled as he explained. It was all part of his plan. Ahriman knew such a declaration would terrify the other mage lords into all charging him at once, and when they arrived, Twilight's eyes widened in understanding. They hit them with the null spell. It was a trap, she said excitedly. Darren nodded. Just so, milady, when the other mage lords arrived they were destroyed. In a single battle, Ahriman cast down the old world order, and on it he built a new one. The null spell ensured that magic would never again allow any one man to wield ultimate power. And afterward, Ahriman spent a lifetime restoring the various kingdoms and cultures he and his former brethren had so callously destroyed. Then when it was all done, he tore down his own stronghold, and returned to the village where he had made his promise of peace. There, before the grave of the elder who had spared him, he died, his task completed, and his promise fulfilled. The villagers then buried him with the elder, giving them a shared gravestone, and on it they wrote, "Here lies proof, that as pride may turn angels to demons, so might mercy turn tyrants to heroes." Twilight blinked tears from her eyes at the bittersweet ending to Darren's tale. Is that story really true? She asked in an odd voice. Darren shrugged as their meal arrived. I am not certain, it happened thousands of years before I was born. But I like to think it is. He replied with a smile. Twilight nodded in agreement. Ahriman kinda reminds me of you, she declared, biting into her hayburger. Darren glanced over at her as he swallowed a mouthful of soup. How so, milady? He asked curiously. You both honor your word no matter what. Twilight replied with a smile. Darren chuckled. I suppose we do.